Welcome to the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies. Today's webinar, The Global Economic Crisis and US-Japan Cooperation from 1971 to 2021, explores how the US and Japan have coordinated and cooperated in times of global crisis, from the 1971 Nixon shocks to the global COVID-19 pandemic we are all experiencing today. The panelists will discuss how Japanese and US institutions and networks have coordinated in three pillars: finance, energy, and trade. The webinar will consist of three 20-minute expert panels with a short bilateral discussion for each panel. Following the third panel, there will be a discussion by the group on how these shock-absorbing mechanisms have evolved and how policymakers can continue to improve these systems going forward. Should you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A box during your presentations for the short panel discussion and concluding group dialogue. The moderators welcome your questions. Finally, we would like to thank the Center for Global Partnership for supporting this research on Geoeconomics of Japan, and hope that everyone here in our audience and panels calling in from both sides of the Pacific gain valuable insights from this webinar. With that, I would like to welcome the Reischauer Center Director, Dr. Ken Calder, to begin today's session.
Thank you very much, Neve, and welcome everyone to this Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies webinar. As Neve has mentioned, our focus is retrospective, and it's also macroscopic, very broad, looking at the past really historic half century of US-Japan relations, and focusing on one of the key questions of that half century, the ability of these two economic powers and also international allies to cooperate with one another, and how that pattern has evolved across the half century since the Nixon shocks, which took place, of course, in last July and last August, just slightly over 50 years ago. And next month, of course, we also have the 50th anniversary of a related catalytic event, President Richard Nixon's visit to China, which sent in motion an important transformation of the relationships in the Pacific. As our speakers, we'll introduce them individually as we go, but we have speakers from both sides of the Pacific. We have American policymakers who have seen these changes in detail over time. We have distinguished academics, and we have distinguished practitioners from outside the region who can also place a experienced and critical eye on the changes that we are going to discuss. As was mentioned, also this webinar is part of a project on the geoeconomics of Japan, in that it has economic dimensions and security dimensions that are intertwined with one another. And the project is sponsored by the Center for Global Partnership, very appropriately, of the Japan Foundation, and we are grateful to them. You might ask at the beginning, why at this particular time would we be doing a subject like this? From the perspective of the global political economy, I think it's really a crucial topic. Japan and the United States, of course, for most of the period that we are looking at, have been the two largest free market economies in the world. For the past 2 decades, they have varied between 20% and a third, roughly, of the global GDP of the world. They also, of course, have rather complementary political economies that potentially create tremendous synergies that can be of global importance if they cooperate. Japan, a large manufacturer, the United States, preeminent in service trade, Japan, a capital surplus nation throughout, the United States frequently a deficit nation, and yet one which is crucial from the point of view of global security. So these complementarities between them, again, if they can cooperate, have been of international importance. In our discussion today, we're going to consider three critical dimensions of that ability of these two economic superpowers to collaborate with one another. First of all, international finance. And secondly, energy. And thirdly, trade. We have three dyadic dialogues, moderated dialogues that will explore the ability over this critical half century of these nations to collaborate. Economic crisis, as we noted in the beginning, were the litmus tests of the ability of our two alliance nations to cooperate. And that has not been, as the story tells us, an easy thing. It's been a challenging thing. We discuss around 10 crises, obviously in the aggregate, but it's useful to remember just what they are. The first one, the 1971 turbulence of the Nixon Shocks. In July of 71, Richard Nixon's announcement of Henry Kissinger's visit to China, and that the fact that President Nixon would be visiting China in the future. And of course, these things announced at the last minute with virtually no forewarning to Japan. In August of 1971, again, unilateralism, the Nixon shock suspending the convertible of the dollar into gold, and also imposing surcharges on imports, particularly from Japan. 2 years later, the oil shocks in the Middle East, the quadrupling of the price of oil, the different ways that the two countries responded. 1979, the Iranian Revolution, again, some significant differences in the responses by Japan and the United States to that development. The Plaza Accord of 1986, in which some of our participants were quite related. The Gulf War of 1990-91, the Asian financial crisis of 97, the shock of the attack on the World Trade Center and the intervention in Afghanistan. 2003, of course, the invasion of Iraq. 2008, the global financial crisis. 2011, many developments both in the Middle East and of course the tsunami in Tohoku of Japan itself. And then finally, as was mentioned, the COVID crisis and the ability of our nations and the world to cooperate there. So it's a large agenda. It's an important story. The findings that we have can only be general, but because this is such an important issue in this anniversary year of the Nixon shocks, we thought that given the distinguished group of participants that we had, that it would be a fruitful time to address that issue. So without any ado, I would like to go forward to the first panel, which I am going to moderate. And let me address our participants for that panel. First of all, we have Professor Yoshiko Kojo, who is currently a professor at the School of International Politics, Economics, and Communication at Aoyama Gakuin University. Prior to her current position, she served for many years as professor of advanced social and international studies at the University of Tokyo, and then played also many distinguished roles in the academic world, including the presidency of Kokusai Seiji Gakkai of Japan. Her PhD is from Princeton University, and Yoshiko, it's a pleasure to see you again. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Kent, for kind introduction. Shall I start?
Please,
Okay.
Looking forward to hearing from you.
Okay, I'd like to use PowerPoint. So can you see?
Yes.
Okay. So in finance section as a topic, I picked up a problem of exchange rate in US-Japan relations. So please look at this chart. I cited this chart from Nihon Keizai Shimbun. So since Nixon shock, the yen has appreciated very sharply. So before the Nixon shock, there was $1 to equal, it was equal to 360 yen, but in 2011, the highest point that $1 was equal to 75 yen. So this was very sharp appreciation. So from 1970 to mid-90s, there was a steep appreciation, in particular after the Plaza Accord of 1985. So Japanese government how to deal with high yen because in Japan, there was always the opposition to high yen, not only in business, but also among politicians. Okay, so as a basis of economic conflict, there was a structure cause that is payment imbalance among industrial states. So the United States had a big payment deficit, while Japan and Germany had a big payment surplus. So regarding the trade relations, United States had a huge trade deficit with Japan. So US pressured Japan to take actions that would cause a substantial appreciation of the yen, so which would eliminate the trade imbalance with the US and payment surplus. So on the other hand, Japan was afraid of the high yen, so which would damage export-oriented industries. So in order to avoid the high yen, Japan chose macroeconomic policy, especially fiscal policy, to adjust payment surplus. So although there was a severe conflict during this period, bilateral negotiation channel was established during this period. So there was a high yen after the Plaza Accord. So US government used the low dollar policy to press Japan to reduce trade surplus with the United States. So US applied a trade-off strategy towards Japan. So a high yen or expansionary macroeconomic policy. So in response to US request, Japan at first chose low interest rate policy facing with fiscal policy. But monetary policy couldn't adjust payment imbalance. So finally, Japanese government ended up to apply expansionary fiscal policy. So behind these policy choices, there were domestic causes. Both government didn't have bigger windset domestically. So the smaller windset. So as for US, Congress was protectionist. And so the Congress pressed government to use exchange rate pressure towards Japan. So in Japan, not only business, but also political parties pressed government to not to use the high-end strategy. So the Japan ended up to use fiscal policy. So high-end changed the Japanese business attitudes. So they moved the production basis not only to US, but also to ASEAN countries to avoid the negative effect of high-end. So after the bubble, Japan suffered from the depression, the so-called lost 20 years. So in this situation, high yen was again regarded as impediment to growth. So US could achieve the high growth by ICT revolutions. So after the mid-90s, the US government kept strong dollar policy. Therefore, the US-Japan economic conflict came to subside. So today, US is now had conflict with China. So in Japan, there was still avoiding high-yen mentality. But nowadays, low yen had negative impact on the economy. So cost of import is increasing, while the negative effect of the high yen on export is getting smaller. So the US-Japan relation after the bilateral conflict, the relation changed from bilateral competitors to partners in multilateral frameworks. So in facing with rise of China, G5 and G7 framework became more important nowadays. So that Japan and the United States are now the partners in multilateral framework. So, but how about cooperation in Asian Pacific region? So Japan put more emphasis on Asian regions. But however, United States was less interested in the existing regional framework, such as the CTPP. So the problem for the both government now is how to cooperate in multilateral framework, especially in Asian region. That is my conclusion. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yoshiko, for a concise presentation and we've certainly learned a lot from that. And we'll come back to this question of the differences, the preference of Japan for the regional and the transformation in the priorities of the United States, even as both countries move to partnership in broader multilateral frameworks. Now for our second presenter, also on the subject of transformation in Japan's, in US-Japan financial relations, we have Professor William Grimes. He's currently Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and also Professor of International Relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. He's had a number of important positions there. Among others, he was the first director of the BU Center for the Study of Asia, and much of his work has had to do exactly with the issue that Professor Kojo raised in conclusion, the rising importance of the regional dimension of US-Japan cooperation. Bill has written Unmaking the Japanese Miracle, Macroeconomic Politics, from Cornell, co-edited Japan's Managing Globalization, and also written Currency and Contest in East Asia, the Great Power Politics of Financial Regionalism, which won the Ohira Prize in 2010. So Bill, it's a real pleasure to have you here. And I wonder what your take would be on the transformation that we have gotten since the Nixon shocks in US-Japan financial relations.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a huge honor and also a pleasure to be here with my former advisor, you, and my former Princeton senpai, Kojo, and long-term friends, Kurt Tong and Bill Brooks as well. So it's a great pleasure to be here. So Professor Kojo has spoken about how Japanese firms and the government reacted to upward pressures on the yen in the 1970s through 1990s. I'll address the related issues of macroeconomic coordination, crisis management, and financial convergence. When President Nixon closed the gold window in August 1971 and allowed the devaluation of the dollar, it was clear that it was a profoundly important event. No one knew exactly what the new world would look like, but governments, central banks, and companies all scrambled to deal with the new circumstances. Some, like the Japanese Ministry of Finance in late August and early September, tried to stop the tide. And many policymakers in Japan, the US, and Europe sought to recreate the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates, albeit with new valuations. The Smithsonian Agreement that December seemed to restabilize the fixed rate system, but within 2 years, it had failed, and the world moved inexorably to floating exchange rates among the major currencies, which is very much where Professor Kojo's story is. Now, the history of macroeconomic and exchange rate coordination since then could be told as largely one of failure, at least if we look at exchange rate stability among major currencies as the measure of success. That story is particularly one of disappointment for Japan, which had a strong preference for exchange rate stability, even as it gave up its commitment to an undervalued yen. And at times, the US used the threat of dollar depreciation, often shorthanded as talking down the dollar, as a tool to open Japanese markets, appreciate the yen, and alter Japanese fiscal and monetary policy. I won't be a downer though. There are different ways of looking at this which tell a more cooperative story, particularly between Japan and the US. And that's what I'll talk about. I'll focus on 3 aspects of history that tell the story: crisis management, growing institutionalization, and convergence of interests. One of the great untold successes of international macroeconomic and financial cooperation in the last 50 years has been crisis management. This has been episodic, but essential to the health of the global economy. To list just a few greatest hits for those who know the history: the London and Bonn summits in 1977 and 78, the dollar rescue package of 1978, the Plaza and Louvre agreements in 1985 and 1987, as well as the 1987 Wall Street crash, Japan's financial crisis of the late 1990s, the global financial crisis in 2008 to 10, the 3/11 triple disaster in Japan, and the ongoing COVID crisis. Episodic in a continual manner, I might say. We've seen this kind of episodic cooperation largely based on G5, G7, and later G20, but always the US and Japan have been at the core of these cooperative efforts that have saved us from, arguably in some cases, Great Depressions, trade crashes, etc. The management of macroeconomic and financial disputes has been supported by institutionalization over the years. Mostly, this has been a soft institutionalization, despite some efforts to create hard rules and agreements. Again, some greatest hits: the London and Bonn summit locomotive theory, the attempt at the Louvre to create a system of multilateral surveillance with objective indicators, G20 efforts, US efforts in the G20 in 2009 to create balance of payments rules. Those have mostly not been successful, but crucially, what we have seen has been a long and complex web of relations among finance and treasury officials, central bankers, and companies that have created common understandings of problems and of each other. And I dare say that we have a couple of examples of that here today. Ken Calder, who worked in the embassy in the 1990s, Kurt Tong as well has been involved, and I know Bill Brooks has as well. And they can all speak, I think, a bit more to the details of it if you will give them a chance. But crucially, the trust and relationships that were developed, even when there were disagreements, allowed for quick action at times of crisis, and has created a structure of conversation and discussion and management of mutual business that has gotten richer and richer over time and more effective, and at least a little bit more in the background as frictions have subsided. Underlying all of this was an increasing convergence of interest between the two countries. While in the 1980s, this may have seemed forced by the US, in fact, the complexity and internationalization of the Japanese economy required greater financial openness and liberalization and expansion of domestic demand. It was definitely a rocky road, and I've written a little bit about that, including the Japanese banking and financial crisis of the 1990s. But the disputes and the problems camouflage the fact that there were increasingly many areas of agreement and of common interests. Since the late 1990s, and despite the continued current account imbalances between the two countries that loomed so large for US-Japan relations in the 70s and 80s, the US and Japan have jointly become champions of financial openness, innovation, and macroprudential supervision, and have become essential to the success and stability and periodic stabilization of the global economy. So, and finally, I'll just note, we have also learned from each other about contemporary challenges such as aging society, deflation, and domestic financial crisis management. There's no way that Ben Bernanke and Larry Summers and Tim Geithner would have been as successful as they were in managing the 2008 crisis in the United States if it were not for their personal involvement in dealing with Japan during the 1990s and understanding the importance of bank recapitalization, nationalization, and other tools that were used to fix our problem in a way that prevented a global Great Depression. And while these disputes have not completely gone away, as seen in occasional continued frictions over exchange rates or even quantitative easing, they are managed respectfully and with a common economic framework. I'll end by saying these have been hard-won lessons, but they have helped to cement the friendship and broader cooperation that we now see between our two countries, and that helps us to underlie the potential, the ongoing success of both the United States and Japan in managing their places in the global economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. You've made a very important point, it seems to me, about the way in which the mutual association and the networks arising from crisis actually have become the basis for cooperation, as well as the mutual learning and so on that have gone on between these two countries. We'll come back to those key points. In that we have so little time, unfortunately, we're going to need to move on to the next of our topics, which is energy. And to coordinate that, to moderate that, I'd like briefly to introduce Dr. William Brooks, who will be the moderator. He's a senior advisor at the Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies. Also, he teaches, he's taught at SAIS since 2009, after retiring from the Department of State. But before that, he served for 15 years as head of the Media Analysis and Translation Unit of the embassy. So, as well as over the years, he served with the economic section. So he's had personally a ringside seat at the evolution of US-Japan relations. He's moderating here the second session will have to do with energy. And so I turn that over to you, Professor Brooks.
Thank you very much, Kent. And in return, I would like to welcome you, Dr. Ken Calder, who literally wrote the books on Japan's political economy that I used over and over again as a student. Dr. Calder is, of course, head of the Reischauer Center and currently vice dean at SAIS. But our friendship goes back to the 1990s when he was advisor to the US ambassador at Embassy Tokyo. Dr. Calder will focus on Japan's energy policy in his remarks. Please, Kent.
Well, let me do that just very briefly, because I also, of course, look forward to hearing from our other distinguished speaker. Just briefly, let me say, Japan and the United States, they're, of course, two of the largest economies in the world, the two largest free market economies, but also very large energy consumers who have rather contrasting profiles of energy consumption. Japan imports 99% of its oil and close to that share of its primary energy. The United States imports only 37% of its oil. It also, of course, does now export also, and 26% of its primary energy. So one is a producer and the other one is almost exclusively an importer. The two countries, of course, have also had very different means of securing supply. The United States, with 5 of the 7 so-called 7 sisters, the largest oil firms in the world, are American. And of course, in political military terms, the United States has also been a preeminent global power, but also, of course, the target of considerable resentment and various problems as well. Maybe one final point. Japan, more than the US, has been much more reliant on the Middle East for its supply. I mentioned 99% of its oil imported, only 26% for the United States, and 85% of Japan's imported oil from the Arabian Gulf, as compared to roughly 20 and even less than that now percent on the part of the US. And so the two countries have had a rather different relationship, and this is what we were thinking of focusing on in a study of energy with the Middle East, and particularly this triangle of the largest oil exporter in the world for many years, Saudi Arabia, and the United States as the largest of the home of the major multinationals, and then Japan as a huge energy importer. 3 countries with rather different interests, which also needed to cooperate in the international system. So to speak next briefly to that issue of this triangle, and Bill, would you, maybe I could just do a brief introduction. Ambassador Abdulaziz Turkistani, we have with us, who spent 8 years as Saudi Arabia's ambassador to Japan with an advanced degree from Waseda University, his PhD in Japan, but also a distinguished career as an academic, a dean of King Saud University in Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Turkistani, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to your thoughts on how the global energy economy has changed and the role of these countries in that.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the Reischauer Center for the East Asian study and Professor Ken Calder for his great invitation. I'm very glad to be here with other distinguished speakers from Japan and United States. Since we are talking about energy in this session, allow me to focus on the evolution of the global energy system within the global political economy over the past half century. In brief, and how countries like United States, Japan, and also Saudi Arabia have responded to those changes. It goes without saying that the relationship between the top oil producing country, the United States, and the top oil exporter, Saudi Arabia, is very important and strategic. Energy has always been the core of contributor to the Saudi foreign relation with other countries like United States and Japan. As we know that Japan is the fourth largest important oil in 2019. If we want to start with the first oil shock back in 73, in the 15th of October, war and the major oil embargo have affected many countries like US and Japan. And this event signaled as a turning point to the international arena as oil and the use of oil has been politicized. Countries like US and Japan realized that the full reliance on oil becoming more like a double-edged sword. On one hand, they need it for manufacture and development, but on the other hand, they sought to diversify the source of oil. For Saudi Arabia, back then, we did not refer it as oil shock. And maybe this is the first time that I say it in the conference that we did not call it oil shock. It's reflected for us the natural right of Arabs and Muslims fighting our rights in the area. This was, of course, followed by 79 oil price increase that mainly caused by the becoming the global economy and sharp increase in demand, followed by the 1991 oil shock in response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which Iraq also was the active member in OPEC, as we know. And amid all this, Saudi Arabia and OPEC generally wanted to see stable oil price. The price of oil at that time was around 50, but we all know that such political and economic crisis or disruption do take place until today, and it is unavoidable. As long as they persist, they will keep influencing the oil market. Despite all these challenges, oil remain an important factor in the international economy and demonstrate how geopolitics of the region have influenced the oil market and still does to today and to this day. Fast forward today and learning from those or these shocks, the US were able to increase oil production, especially with its abundance of the oil shale, and they become energy sufficient. For example, November 2019, as I remember, United States became a net exporter to all oil products, including both refined petroleum and products and the crude oil. By 21, the US was the world's largest producer. This shows the scale of change of dependence from a century ago to today. Let's talk a little bit about Japan. They try to minimize the dependence on oil and reach almost 70% at one stage, but since 2008 financial crisis and Lehman crisis, of course, by the devastating earthquakes and tsunami, it was difficult to continue with ambitious goal. Moreover, Japan keen to continue improving its relationship with the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, preciously through the infrastructure projects. However, they excelled, of course, in various energy technologies, which is we in Saudi Arabia are cooperating with them at. Saudi Arabia respectively relied on the long-term strategic plan that have now been proven, especially after the establishment of Oil Plus, to be effective in stabilizing the market. Saudi Arabia's slogan has always been maintaining the price that preserve the interest both producer and the important and the fair distribution of the production among the industrialized countries. Today or currently, the relationship is very limited between America and Saudi Arabia in defense and oil, but it should go beyond, include the alternative energy like peaceful nuclear energy, transfer of the know-how, all the downstream industry that we think that America can be an added value to Saudi Arabia Vision 2030, which is be announced in 2016. While countries, on the other hand, like US, are not centering their priorities within the Middle East, especially after they become more energy sufficient. East Asian countries like China, Japan, South Korea actually sees the opposite. They see the region full of opportunities. Maybe we know about the blue ammonia has been exported from Saudi Arabia to Japan is a 40-ton, which is starting of the new generation of the energy. And maybe they will have not only blue ammonia, but also they have a green ammonia in the near future. Let me say here finally that when we talk about the energy, we are talking about the global energy map that have same fate, shares some obstacles, and that's why cooperation and energy is and synergy is very important. If a big countries like US and Japan and Saudi Arabia saw more cooperation in this field, they will be able to have a positive impact on the stability of the oil market and the peace in the world. While it is very important to talk about oil, it is still very important to this day. But finally, I can say the green energy is the future. Thank you very much, and sorry to be, I hope I was on time.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Turkestani. Kent, do you have any further comments or remarks based on the ambassador's presentation?
Yes, I have to say, Ambassador Turkestani made, to me, some rather counterintuitive points about energy. We usually think of the energy agenda globally, and especially with Saudi Arabia, as being a matter of oil supply and the price of oil. But he noted alternate energy as an area. Of course, that opens up large possibilities for Japan to contribute to this triangular relationship, to help in supplying alternate energy technology to even to Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
So that they can economize on their oil supply. If I'm not mistaken about that. That was an interesting point. The other thing was about ammonia, blue and green ammonia. I haven't heard much about ammonia being a issue for the energy agenda. Those are the key points that occurred to me.
Thank you very much, Kent. So for our concluding panel, I'd like to reintroduce Dr. Grimes. Bill, you're the moderator for the third panel. The podium is yours.
So I can't seem to turn on my, okay, now I can start my video. So I'm happy to introduce very briefly our two distinguished speakers. So Bill Brooks has been introduced, but I'll say it again. He's a senior advisor at the Reischauer Center at SAIS and an adjunct professor there since 2009, after serving for 15 years as the head of the US Embassy's Media Analysis and Translation Unit in Japan, which is an an essential but not always well-known part of what the embassy does, and spent a long and distinguished career in the State Department, including in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, having earned a PhD at Columbia University. Ambassador Kurt Tong is currently a partner and member of the executive committee at the Asia Group, where he leads the firm's work in Japan and Hong Kong. But before that, he had a 30-plus year career in the State Department as a career and foreign service officer and member of the senior foreign service, with many interesting and exciting posts. But just as a couple of the highlights, he was the Consul General and Chief of Mission in Hong Kong and Macau. He served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs at State, and he was the Deputy Chief of Mission and Chargé d'Affaires at the US Embassy in Tokyo. They both have great experience and a lot to tell us, so I will stop here and let them do that.
Thanks, Bill. And as I understand it, in our speed dating tonight, I'm up first. So I thought I'd just make a couple declaratory statements about trade policy, coordination, cooperation, negotiation between the US and Japan, and how that might relate to some of the other aspects that have already been discussed. For those who are, there might be some people on this event, on this call, who are too young to remember, but for about 15 years in the 1980s and 1990s, the economic relationship between the US and Japan was primarily defined by conflict rather than cooperation. And it was quite a heated conflict, despite the fact that the US and Japan were steadfast treaty allies at that time, as they remain today. And there was a quick succession of institutional frameworks which were established, at the request of the United States and the acquiescence of Japan, to attempt to deal with this perception that the United States was getting an unfair deal from the economic relationship, primarily on trade matters. During the Reagan administration, there were voluntary export restraints and other tough sectoral-based negotiations directly addressing the question of surging Japanese imports to the United States in key technologies, including semiconductors, automobiles, things like satellites, etc. There was a short but intense interaction by the Treasury Department with its counterparts in the yen-dollar talks, which started to talk about structural issues a bit, followed by a whole of government conversation in the Bush administration, first Bush administration, on this called the Structural Impediments Initiative, which attempted to go at the what were suspected to be the root causes of the structural imbalances between the US and Japan in the trade relationship. After which we saw the revisionists come to the fore in the Clinton administration with a more sectoral based and more directed, more leverage reliant approach in the framework talks, trying to achieve specific outcomes in automobiles in particular, but in a variety of topics. So it was a combination of structural and sectoral. And then things went quiet because the Japanese economy started to perform very poorly, and the main concern for the United States shifted, frankly, from Japan being too strong to Japan being too weak. And as the Asian financial crisis had revealed many of the flaws in the Japanese growth model that had been conducted up to that time. Bill Grimes knows this very well and has written some very good books about it. And the US and Japan never really re-engaged intensively on trade issues on a bilateral basis until Japan asked to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a long and complex story that we won't get into. But this was this history of those negotiations. The first thing to keep in mind is that the driver of it, although Dr. Calder at the beginning listed 10 crises that were challenges for the US-Japan economic relationship and the management of the relationship, these were all endogenous, not exogenous. This was the United States trying to change the relationship. So the US was the crisis, not some event that happened where the US and Japan were trying to work on it together. That's different, and that's important to keep in mind. The second point I would make is that I would characterize the entire episode, all 2 decades of it, as searching for leverage, ways to force, convince, cajole, request Japan to make changes to its system primarily, while maintaining a strong alliance relationship. And the fundamental dynamic of those participating in all of those was a sense of trying to achieve the right balance between creation of leverage, because leverage generally exacerbates conflict, but at the same time maintaining the strong alliance relationship both during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period. That led to certain patterns of activity and negotiation that are distinct and special in the case of allies conducting very difficult talks. So the third point then is, what were those choices that then people had to make in the context of trying to maintain an alliance while creating leverage? And there are a lot of choices to be made, and you saw that in the differences between those episodes that I mentioned. Whether to emphasize process or whether to emphasize results in how you portray the purpose of an interaction. Are you trying to manage an issue, or are you definitely going to get something done? And if you don't get something done, it's somebody's fault and somebody's going to have to pay. Do you emphasize structural issues, so cross-cutting questions about the economy, savings and investment balance, the price of land, things which are sort of underlying factors in economic imbalances? Or do you go directly at sectoral approaches and try and specifically change the numbers in specific areas of the economy? Do you seek binding outcomes, like a treaty that if you break it, you're going to get punished? Or is it a non-binding outcome where you're just making aspirational statements and trusting one another to implement it? In seeking for leverage, do you use positive leverage or negative leverage? Positive leverage will be in the form of something like a two-way trade agreement, trade opening agreement, where each side agrees to do something that the other wants. Or is it, you do this or I'm going to sanction you or put tariffs on you? Do you do a one-way approach or a two-way approach? Japan, many times during these stories, insisted very much on having a two-way approach, so that there was something that Japan was asking of the United States, and as well as the US asking for change on Japan's part. And the last one is it gaiatsu or naiatsu? Are you just bringing pressure and you got to do it because we say so? Or are you trying to convince people inside the counterpart economy, political economy, to take your cause up and participate in a sort of revolutionary movement to change policy in that economy? I went through that long list. It's a lot of choices, right? Went to the 6, went by times 2, factorial. I don't know. I'm not a math person. There's a lot of different ways that you could come up with a framework for all of this. But the fundamental characteristic at the end of the day, in the US-Japan sense, was that you still wanted to maintain the alliance. You wanted to maintain a functional relationship, and you wouldn't take things too far. So the last point I would make is in the sense of what are the implications, and one of the persons in the chat mentioned this, and I do a session in my class on this, comparing the approach to Japan to the approach to China now, is what are the implications for, say, the United States trying to tackle the China problem in the current day and age? And I would say that there are two. One is that the use of leverage, the decisions on each of those decisions, those exist in the China context as well. But the outcome of the policy-making, decision-making is going to be quite different when you have a relationship which is characterized first and foremost by competition rather than by teamwork. You're in a competitive relationship with China, not an alliance by any stretch of the imagination. And so that informs your tool choice and your willingness to compromise, your willingness to use some kinds of leverage or give up that leverage, et cetera. The other thing that's different is that because the societies are not positively inclined towards one another and the trust level is so low, the patience might not pay off. And this is why there's greater risk in the China case of a escalatory cycle where the trade relationship becomes truly awful and we cross over into decoupling and an economic semi-Cold War, because the brakes on that escalation are not there, because you can no longer trust, as the US always kind of expected, that if we talked to Japan long enough, if we had enough dialogue, that the systems of the US economic system, the US Japanese economic system would somehow converge and a lot of problems would be solved. That does not exist in the China context, and it creates a lot of problems in going forward. So let me stop there, Bill. I probably went on a little bit long, but thought that would be a lay down for it.
Thanks very much. We'll go straight to Bill Brooks.
Okay. Yeah, I hope you can hear me now because my thing was turned off. What I'd like to do, since Kurt has really given a fairly coherent and comprehensive look at the last several decades, I'd like to put in some of my own experiences to sort of buttress not only Kurt's remarks, but also Bill Grimes' remarks earlier. Actually, from 1980 to late 1982, I was a second secretary in the economics section of U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. And my portfolio included and actually became centered on Japan's official development assistance, as well as multilateral economic policy in the UN and other international organizations. And I can guarantee you that the US and Japan cooperated during that period. It may have been terrible for the trade policy types, but for ODA, Japan at that time was the second largest ODA donor in the world, and for cooperation in the United Nations agencies, Japan was sterling. In fact, Washington under the Reagan administration discovered that Japan had all this cash going out to foreign countries, and decided that we would ask Japan to share some of those ODA loans and grants to countries that were of strategic interest to nations in the West, the United States, and countries that were becoming democracies. And Japan was quite willing to do so. It was an elaborate arrangement, usually involving high-level letters from either the State Department or even from the Treasury Department and even the White House. But Japan did provide extraordinary amount of aid to countries that were considered to be of importance to the West. And indeed, I found my own job going around with my tin cup to different parts of the foreign ministry, extremely enriching. Indeed, I built up a lot of good contacts with foreign ministry officials and others during that period. And that cooperation, because you meet somebody and that cooperation exists throughout your career, continued on and on and on. In fact, going ahead to 1989, 1990, when Japan was in a bind over what to do about China, Tiananmen incident, and the West had basically curtailed all foreign aid, including Japan, to China. During that period, just by chance, I happened to be involved in some of the negotiations, not even negotiations, just talks with the Japanese government. And they were quite willing to slowly but surely bring China back into the international community in order to preserve the moderate government that was then in charge of Beijing. Then my other encounter meant with Japan's cooperativeness was in the late 80s when I was again in the economics section. And this time I was involved with trade policy, reporting on public works, construction, agricultural issues, beef and rice. And then for about a year, from 1989 to 1990, deeply involved in the structural impediment initiatives, SII talks, responsible for distribution, the distribution sector issues, anti-monopoly law, outer trade issues, and the big problem, the large store law, which was part of the over-regulation of the services sector in Japan. And I found that Washington's goal of deregulation of distribution to allow more foreign goods and foreign investment into Japan to topple the large store law as a symbol was met with the same kind of enthusiasm on the Japanese side. In other words, gaiyatsu and naiyatsu, internal pressure and external pressure came together. We were able to find those in the Japanese business spheres, as well as in the government, MITI at the time, quite willing to get rid of some of these obsolete rules and regulations that allow competition into that sector. And the structural barriers, of course, slowly but surely disappeared. So the SII, of course, tackled a lot of other issues as well, but in my area, it was really successful. The third, I think, impression that I get of Japan's cooperation, and it signals a different tone, a different type of approach to trade, was with TPP. Because up until then, when Japan joined the negotiations in the early 2010s, Japan had focused on gaiyatsu, but in this case, there was a lot of naiyatsu, particularly after the DPJ left and the Abe came in. There was a tremendous amount of interest in TPP in order to force Japan to structurally change its economy, particularly in the agricultural sector. So there was a sea change in its trade policy towards a proactive Japan. And I think that after the US withdrew, Japan saved the TPP, and that represents to me a very important change in the Japanese psyche of trying to be a leader in the area and not rely totally on foreign pressure in order to open not only its markets, but in order to gain markets in the whole region. I'll close there because I think I'm running beyond my time frame.
Thanks very much. I think you're right on the time. And before we turn it over to the sort of the full panelists discussion that I believe Ken Calder will be running, I just wanted to touch on that last point of Bill Brooks about the ways in which Japan has become really a leader for institutionalization, liberalization in the global economy. We see it in various trade agreements. We see it in Japan's role in the G20. We see it in a variety of places. And this is something, by the way, my friend Saori Katada has written a very excellent book about. But I wonder maybe if Kurt can give us a sense of what do you think changed? Is it that Japan's interest changed? Is it that the United States somehow changed Japan, or is something else going on?
Well, I think for one thing, yes, you're right to characterize Japanese foreign economic policy at this point as primarily an execution of thought leadership on a global basis in ways that the United States is not doing. Because of our domestic political situation, we're not capable of doing it as well as we used to. And how Japan got there is really a matter of developing strong relations with many countries, having a vision, being highly integrated into the global economic system, and having that integration function relatively smoothly. So the problem years for Japan was when it was integrating rapidly with the global system, but doing it in ways that the rest of the world was kind of getting indigestion. But that is no longer the case, in part because the Japanese economy is growing much more slowly. And so it's providing key factor inputs and financing and things like that, which a lot of countries want, along with good ideas, good technology. And it's well organized. It has long-term stable leadership in its politics. The international economic policy is not a matter of high debate internally within Japan. So there's multiple reasons for that. It's sort of a thank God situation that at least there's a couple countries out there, including Japan, that are able to really focus on the fabric of the global system at this point in time, because the things are becoming quite dicey.
Thank you. Kent, do you want to take over the moderation at this point, or shall I sort of go through the Q&As that are on the board to start with? So
Why don't you, Bill, you're free to do that. Why don't you just go ahead?
Okay, so I think that a couple of the questions on the board, probably because people were paying attention.
I think everyone else can come back on. Should we have all the panelists coming back on? Ambassador Turkestani and Professor Kojo. Good. Okay, Bill, go ahead.
So maybe I should start with some of the questions that were posted to the Q&A, and also invite participants to post more if you have some. I think a lot of them were posted early, so I don't want Yoshiko and I to take over the whole thing. I maybe will start with this question of exchange rate stability was mentioned as a measure of successive cooperation, and why should that be? And I want to be a little careful about that, and perhaps I wasn't really clear, but a lot of countries have preferences for exchange rate stability. That was certainly Japan's preference at any given time. And for many of the people who were, consider themselves almost the high priests of the international economy, that really was a goal. If you, I had the amazing good fortune of working as a research assistant to Paul Volcker and Toyo Gyoten, thanks largely to Ken Calder, who had accepted me to the PhD program at Princeton, so I was in the right place at the right time. But they both understood that they worried about volatility, and they worried about imbalances in the global system. So I agree with the point that exchange rates should move, but exchange rate stability was a goal at various points. And if you just look at Europe, it remains so. I mean, they ended up with such a preference for stability that after multiple efforts to restabilize intra-European exchange rates, they created the euro. Maybe not a good idea, but those were in fact really important pieces of the story. I'm not sure. So I wonder if maybe we can then go to the question that was raised by Joran Lee about looking at the US-China trade war. What lessons can we learn from the history of US-Japan economic conflict? And perhaps we should start with Kirk Tong, and who's also dealt with some of that US-China conflict as well. And you can tell us a little bit about some of the lessons that you've learned from that and how you've tried to apply them.
Well, I think I touched on this a little bit already, but one of the lessons is that these to try and achieve resolution to large-scale imbalances between large economies requires decades of work. And so then in the US-China context, is there the patience and the willingness to give credit where credit is due and avoid escalation of tensions while achieving that kind of convergence? And is there a will to achieve it? And so I actually think that the answer to both those questions is no. And that the outer limits of US-China trade negotiation and quote unquote trade cooperation will actually be a fundamental breakdown in that effort, and continued small scale decoupling in certain areas of the economy, particularly around sensitive technologies, and that there will be a quiet period where there is no conversation and no progress being made, and rather just residual tension and difficulty.
Thanks. And can I just sort of bounce that over to Bill? Because Bill, when you were talking about the SAI period and TPP, we were really talking about the ways in which common interests in Japan, transnational interests, were able to combine to shift policy changes within Japan. And in my own experience, I can say that there are a lot of subnational actors in China that have strong interest in continued cooperation with the United States, whether it's companies, financial institutions, the central bank. But the policymaking system is very, very different. So Bill, are there any lessons that we can bring from the Japanese experience, or is it just that that in China the policymaking is opaque and is dominated by a different set of preferences than the corporate preferences that that Yoshiko talked about and that you talked about?
Yeah, the Mayakawa report, which was under the Nakasone administration, it was a non-binding report, called for the opening of Japan through structural reforms. And it represented, I think, not just a bunch of academics sitting in a room, but it represented the corporate view of Keidanren and other business associations. And in my own experience, the distribution sector. And of course, it was the precursor of the SII talks. One of the reasons why Japan was willing to go into the structural talks, one of the reasons was, of course, they wanted to tell us what to do, but they were willing to accept what we wanted them to do because they recognized the problems, but had no internal leverage with the politicians. And at that time, of course, the lobbies, agriculture and other lobbies were quite strong. So yeah, the initial crack in the protectionist wall came with the SII talks. And then other liberalization occurred later on in the 1990s. The lost decade also, the forces of globalization forced Japanese companies to move offshore. And they had to get rid of their old business models. The whole ball of wax just sort of collapsed slowly. But as Ulrich Schade has pointed out in her studies, the Japanese stealth economy of many corporations began to move offshore, to build supply chains all over Asia, to start supplying the essential components and high-tech parts for different widgets. And that's the real strength of the Japanese economy, enormous amount of overseas investment, so that now the current account is basically supporting the investments overseas, is basically supporting the Japanese economy. So this was a global change, but it occurred so slowly. Probably Japan wasn't even recognized as doing that until maybe 10 or 20 years ago.
I'm going to turn to another one of the questions on the board, which was directed to Dr. Abdulaziz, Ambassador Abdulaziz, or excuse me, yeah. So how has the role of Iran, especially given their presence in the sea lanes and Strait of Hormuz, been affecting the energy transit to big importers like Japan? You're muted right now.
Yes, when we talk about Iran, we should note that their disturbing behavior in the sea and the lands, we all know that China and Japan rely on these lanes in their energy import and would want to play a role in its security. 80% of the Saudi and Emirati oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz, mainly the Asian market. Iran, unfortunately, has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz several times if nuclear deal with the US won't be maintained. This disturbance is destabilizing the energy market, and therefore perhaps we have to see more pressure on Iran from US and Japan. And Japan has tried always the neutral and a good mediator role between the Gulf countries and Iran, especially when the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited Iran. I think it was in 2019. So I think Iran should be pushed to be more giving stable to the region: Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon. And this will affect directly and indirectly to the stabilization of the oil and the energy market, not only in the region, but also in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Kent, I wonder if you'd be willing to say a little something about this as well, since you've written quite a bit about the ways in which Japan has responded to its insufficiency of energy and being reliant on areas that are well outside of its security control. Are we seeing new stories these days?
I think that it's quite interesting to see the evolution of Japan's relationship with Iran and some of the things that have driven it. Of course, until surprisingly recently, Iranians didn't even need visas to enter Japan. And in spite of the tensions in the US relationship with Iran, including the hostage crisis and so on, relations between Japan and Iran actually continued to be relatively good. Ambassador Turkestani mentioned, of course, Prime Minister Abe's visit, or I guess you did, Bill, and so on. It's to me, it's rather interesting to see the transformation. I think Japan still wants to be probably a mediator in all of this, but once again, to my mind, at least, I'm sure things like the activities of Ambassador Turkestani's own diplomacy might have been a piece of this. The relationship with Saudi Arabia and Japan, I think, is improved, and conversely, relations between Japan and Iran have grown more complicated. Certainly, the factors that were mentioned, along the conflicts in the Strait of Hormuz, that's been a piece of it. But I certainly I see that there's a lot more Japanese interest in these issues, but also on the Arab side of the Gulf. I think there's definitely stronger relationships with the GCC that have evolved, and those haven't been, they are probably related also to the United States and the evolution of American policy as well, I should think. Of course, the development of Iranian nuclear weapons and those long negotiations, with Iran have affected this significant transformation. I'd be interested in Kurt's sense also of how that relationship in this triangle or quadrangle of the US, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran has evolved. Kurt, what do you think?
I don't consider myself an expert in this, but I do think that the US has been frustrated at times with Japan's willingness to emphasize the relationship with Iran, but it has tried to take advantage of the strength of that relationship on occasion. More often, it's been frustrated with the strength of it. But things bounce back and forth, and these days, I think there's quite a lot of tension in the U.S.-Saudi relationship as well. So I think Japan has navigated the problem set skillfully, but has not really been an important partner for either the US or the EU in resolving the regional dilemmas. More sort of been a follower than a leader in the matter.
Mhm.
There's a question about RCEP up there, but let me just go first to Dr. Kojo, because a number of the points that were made about Japan's role in the global economy had to do with the growing globalization of interests, which seems to have a lot to do with the multinationalization of companies, the offshoring, and the growing international assets. That seems to link in somewhat to your story, Yoshiko, of the ways in which Japanese companies' interests about the value of the yen changed over time. And I wonder if you have any comments to say about that relationship between the preferences about the value of the yen and the globalization of companies, and then the changing interests of Japan in becoming just a stalwart of the international institutionalization of the international economic order.
Thank you, Will. I told that there was still the anti-high-end mentality in Japan, but I think that in business, I don't think there is such a big opposition to high-end. So as I told you, that because they came to recognize the negative effect of low yen, because Japan imported lots of things such as energy, that the oil or such the resource of energy. So the company came to realize that the low yen was not so good. So that the preference among business diverse nowadays. So the business, in terms of business, that there was little opposition to high end, I think. So, but still, among politicians, there was such a mentality. So, because they thought that Japan is an export-oriented country to get the profit from overseas. But I think the industry structure has changed. So I don't think the high end was not so big problem among business, I think.
The story, as I usually tell with my students, is that the part of what happened with the high yen was that the creation of regional production networks, as Japanese companies moved more and more of their production off overseas, and because they did it extremely quickly, the value of the yen in nominal terms against the dollar doubled in the space of 2 years, year and a half actually. The Japanese companies sort of moved a whole raft of stuff that had been kind of completely uncompetitive and marginally uncompetitive and slightly competitive, and they moved it off all at once. And they did it in a divided way. And when Kurt and I were both in the Philippines, we were actually seeing this thing in real time. I expect that Kurt saw a lot more of it than I did, but it was quite striking. And that's got something to do with that convergence of interests and understanding of how of the role of government and business and international organizations that I think several of us have spoken about. I do want to go to back to that comment that was raised about RCEP, which seems to have disappeared. But I wonder if maybe we could ask Kurt and then maybe Kent to speak about the importance of RCEP. Is this a game changer? Is this something that is going to that is going to create problems for the United States or for Japan? How do you understand this from a sort of a geoeconomic perspective?
Well, I guess I'll jump in first since you mentioned me first. But I don't think it's a game changer. I think it's a significant. I like this word fabric creator for all the major economies, with the exclusion of Taiwan, in the Asia Pacific area, east of Bangladesh, to be knit together and have a basic set of rules. It's not as fundamental an agreement, and often, there's constant comparisons made to TPP, and RCEP comes up short in terms of its reach into domestic policy and the requirements for accession to the agreement. But it does lower tariffs significantly in a lot of relationships, and it stabilizes economic relationships that could be troubled, creates dispute settlement mechanisms to a certain degree, allows for cross-investment and services trade in ways that weren't possible previously, has intellectual property rights rules. There are some significant aspects to the agreement that could really improve some surprising economic relationships, like Japan-Korea, for example, or Korea with some of the nations of Southeast Asia. So it's significant. The main significant for the US is that we're out of it, and we don't get, and because it is by nature not a most favored nation agreement, unlike TPP, the US actually gets a lot of the benefit from TPP without being in it because of the behind the border changes that nations make in order to join it. We don't get any of the benefit of RCEP, or very little. And that is significant. And, that's why we did TPP, but we blew it. So there you go.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would agree with that very much. And the question was the meaning for US-Japan relations, precisely because the US is not in and Japan is in. It does pull the two countries in a slightly different direction. And that's an issue, of course, that's beginning to dawn for the future, depending on the patterns of growth and, well, of course, many other aspects, intellectual property protection. It seems to me that probably technology and the vibrancy of American technology and intellectual property protection and so on will pull Japan continually toward on the US side, but there is a new engine which is operating that also will pull Japan to some degree toward Asia. So the future, maybe to take this to the large issues that we're looking at, of if the last 50 years or so has been pulling us in terms of process, probably, and I guess I would say probably in terms of many aspects of results toward some degree of convergence, some of the new things that are happening may be pulling in other directions. I have to say, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. There's some things that reaffirmed things that I have always believed. Some of what Bill, you were saying about the way that crisis leads to deeper networks. And of course, I've thought for a long time that there were silver linings in crisis, and it brings people close together in important ways. It creates networks. There are lessons in terms of best practice or worst practice that flow even out of conflict. And it was certainly the 70s. It's hard to see the 70s, to my mind, in many other ways than an era of turbulence and transformation. There is the issue of, how do you judge success that we heard, I think Gary Tallarico was raising that whole question. How does one think of foreign exchange stability or any given indicator as an evidence of success or not? There are those questions, but over the long sweep of history, our two countries, I do believe, have come to understand each other better. They haven't always agreed, but some of the kind of conflicts that we had in the 70s, like the Nixon shocks themselves, or like the soybean embargo, or like the Japan's pro-Arab shift in 1973, and while the United States was being embargoed, or in 1979, the way Japan was furiously trying to get oil supplies from Iran, even after the Iranian Revolution. Those kind of issues we've seen less. So, I mean, those things, a lot of what we talked about there sort of does coincide. You know, Bill, of course, recounted a lot of that, and Kurt, who have such deep policy experience on these things. I have to say, particularly to our two non-US participants, to me, have taught me some things that, you know, I mean, we hear them occasionally, but the difference in perspective, I think, is something for those of us, much of our audience is non-US or is US, to think about. Yoshiko, for example, talked about how the conflicts, at least politically, between Japan and the United States began to wane as Japan began to look vulnerable and as Japanese growth began to decelerate, and Japan didn't look like it was as much of a threat as it has previously. That's something Americans, to my mind, we don't tend to make that observation or to see that point quite as often. And then Ambassador Turkestani pointed out to us that energy issues are not, it's not simply a matter of oil security these days, and in the relationships with the Middle East, that alternative energy, even in Saudi Arabia, is becoming more of a concern. And that, of course, opens the way for new forms of cooperation between both the United States and Japan and other nations in the world. So I've learned a lot. I only wish that we had more time. And I really sincerely thank all of the participants here. It makes me, you know, it's a special feeling to see all that the people on this screen have done over the years and the kind of community that we've begun to form. I also want to thank, of course, those who produced behind the scenes, Neve Denny, Lauren Mosley, our Reischauer Fellows. I know a lot of them are here. I see right to the end, we have a rather large crowd as well from both sides of the Pacific. So to be continued. Looking forward to the next iteration, and thank you, everybody. Thanks again.